If you are interested in pre-ordering and supporting my upcoming documentary, In Search of the Last Action Heroes, detailing the rise and fall of the 80s action star, with contributions from director Richard Donner, writer Stephen E. D'Souza, actors Bill Duke, Jeanette Goldstein, Michael Biehn, Cynthia Rothrock and Ronnie Cox, just to name a few. You can find a link below.
All my life, I've been careful to stay in my own corner. Looking out for number one, no complications. Now suddenly, I'm responsible for the entire fucking world. And everybody and his mother is trying to kill me if my head doesn't blow up first.
Good morning. This is your wake-up call.
How about it, Ralphie?
And hello to you too.
So what have you got?
It depends. Did you get that upgrade we were discussing?
Yeah.
Very good.
Your storage capacity is now 160 gigabytes. Warning, do not exceed capacity.
Pickup is in Central Beijing tomorrow night. 10 o'clock. Don't be late, Johnny.
You don't look like the kind of people I usually work for.
We are new at this.
Who's the target?
Scientists, Farmcom R&D people, defectors.
Hit me. I'm way overloaded, man. You would not believe how much.
Warning, detected synaptic seepage. Neural failure within 24 hours. Seek medical attention immediately.
I got the goods, Ralphie. Now I just want to get them out of my head. Did they get the code out?
Don't worry. I've been charged with recovering the head of the Mnemonic courier, cryogenically preserved.
Preserved?
The traders wiped the Farmcom mainframe. If we lose the courier, they've lost the data forever.
If the courier is in Newark, it's my responsibility.
So how do you fit all that shit in your head anyway?
I had to dump a chunk of long-term memory.
You had to dump a chunk of what?
My childhood.
Your childhood.
I need your services.
And who is this lost soul, this sinner unrepentant?
A courier. Last seen at the drone. Name is Johnny.
You got a head full of Farmcom data, and they've hired the Yakuza to get it out.
Farmcom?
April the 15th, 1995, the cyberpunk sci-fi thriller Johnny Mnemonic hit the big screen in Japan. It made its way to the USA on the 26th of May, but didn't arrive in the UK until the 9th of February 1996. Based on a short story by William Gibson, the father of cyberpunk fiction, artist and music video director Robert Longo directed the film. The movie had a budget of $26 million and only managed to bring in $52 million worldwide. It did poorly in the USA as it was up against Batman Forever and Die Hard with a Vengeance, hitting the number 4 spot at the box office. It wasn't a total flop, but was considered a disappointment for Columbia Pictures as they pushed it heavily with advertising, with a dedicated website and internet marketing, which was a new direction for the time for film studios, and the star Keanu Reeves, who had success the year before in Speed, had failed to pull in a large audience. This was mostly down to its reviews, which were mostly negative. Critics felt it was a dull film with little action, with a derivative storyline, and Keanu Reeves was heavily criticised for his performance, and he was nominated for a Golden Raspberry Award that year for the Worst Actor. It was, however, praised for its production design and visual effects. This would also be the last theatrical release Dolph Lundgren would star in until The Expendables 15 years later. The film was a moderate success on theatrical release, but it did find success on home video and became a cult favourite, and still to this day it brings in a profit for Sony, and the director revealed in his recent commentary for the German Blu-ray release that he still gets residuals. Johnny Mnemonic would be Robert Longo's first and only feature film he directed. Robert was a popular artist during the 80s. His black and white Men in the City series, photographed with limbs akimbo, became a hallmark of that decade, even popping up in American Psycho. Robert had directed a few music videos for artists such as Megadeth and New Order, but never a feature. Robert wanted to adapt William Gibson's short story. He envisioned an art film shot in black and white, taking inspiration from Jean-Luc Godard's 1965 film Alphaville. He and Gibson struggled to find financing. They only needed under $1 million to make it, but gained no interest initially. As technology was rapidly changing in the 90s with the rise of the internet, cyberpunk had become increasingly relevant, and the Johnny Mnemonic story came to the attention of Columbia TriStar Pictures, who wanted to fund it and gave Robert Longo and his producer a large budget to work with, seeing the profitability in the story and its themes. Longo, before signing on, had to get directors to vouch for him, such as Martin Scorsese and Joel Schumacher for Columbia Pictures, to allow him to direct, but he quickly realised once he took the job he was losing any creative control. William Gibson would write the screenplay, but Columbia wasn't happy with it and wanted constant rewrites, attempting to make a more mainstream film, which ultimately left them with no ending, as they had to start shooting as soon as possible to gain funding. As mentioned earlier, the film Johnny Mnemonic is based on a short story of the same name by American-Canadian writer William Gibson. The short story was first published in May 1981. The film's plot differs considerably from the short story, most notably turning Johnny, not his bodyguard partner, into the primary action figure. They introduced nerve attenuation syndrome, a fictional disease called NAS, also called the Black Shakes, which is caused by an overexposure to electromagnetic radiation from the technology around them, and is presented as a raging epidemic affecting the world in the future. The plot of the film revolves around one pharmaceutical corporation that has found a cure, but chooses to withhold it from the public in favour of a more lucrative treatment program. When it came time to casting the film, Robert Longo had little choice on who they cast. For the lead of Johnny Mnemonic, Val Kilmer was originally signed on, and there was even a teaser poster produced with his name attached, but Val was proving difficult, and was holding out to star in Batman Forever, and jumped ship as soon as he got the part, leaving the production struggling for a new lead. In steps Keanu Reeves. He was picked by the studio due to his success in Speed. Keanu was a rising star, and they felt his star power could elevate its box office success. The character of Johnny is a mnemonic courier, with a data storage device implanted in his brain, allowing him to discreetly carry information too sensitive to transfer across the net. While lucrative, the implant has cost Johnny his childhood memories, and he seeks to have the implant removed to regain his memories back. The famous Japanese actor and director Takeshi Kitano plays Takahashi, the head of Pharmacom. Takahashi lost his daughter to NAS and needs to get the data back from Johnny. Takeshi only had a small number of days to work on the film, and those days were spread over 3 months, so the shooting schedule had to be strictly coordinated to fit around the days he was available. Dennis Akiyama, who sadly passed away this year, plays Shinji. He is tasked with hunting down Johnny and to retrieve the data stored in his brain, and is armed with a laser whip. He is not concerned with keeping Johnny alive and will take just the head if necessary. The always reliable Udo Kier plays Ralphie, who runs a club and deals in pretty much everything that is illegal. Ralphie is Johnny's handler and sends him out on his final mission, with promises that he will restore his memory, but he has other plans for the data in Johnny's head. Dolph Lundgren was cast as the priest called Kyle, who runs the Church of Technology. He is hired by Takahashi to hunt down Johnny, but once he realises the data he is carrying is the cure, he wants it for himself. To gain the financing for the production, they needed to please distributors in different countries, which resulted in Dolph having to be cast, which frustrated Robert Longo, who didn't want him involved. Longo and the author Gibson didn't know what to do with Lundgren, so they dressed him in robes and long hair and sent him out on the streets as a doomsday prophet. Sony cut 90% of Dolph's role, feeling it would offend the religious right, so he ends up having little to no character in the film. He ultimately just pops up to start attacking people. Robert had originally shot a backstory for Dolph that was cut, where he is preaching entirely naked to a church full of women who are afflicted with the NAS. Dina Meyer, who many of us remember from Starship Troopers, plays Jane, a drug addict with enhancements to operate as a bodyguard, and eventually works for Johnny. She is suffering from the black shakes caused by NAS. The rapper Ice-T was cast as J-Bone. He is part of the rebellion against the new powers. He is hijacking the networks to broadcast his message. And last but not least, we have musician Henry Rollins as Spider, the flesh mechanic who used to operate as a legitimate doctor, but helps NAS sufferers and provides enhancements for those willing to go under the knife. The film was shot on location in Canada, with Toronto and Montreal filling in for the film's Newark and Beijing settings. A number of local sites including Toronto's Union Station and Montreal's skyline and Jacques Cartier Bridge feature prominently. The opening sequence with Keanu was shot 6 months later after shooting Wrapped, as Columbia Pictures felt it needed a backstory to his character. You'll notice throughout the majority of the movie Keanu is very slim on purpose to show the damage done to his body, but the opening act he has gained a lot of weight. Robert was unhappy throughout the shoot, and even when it came time to editing, the action was subpar. It was handled by Vic Armstrong and his team. The studio kept pushing for action sequences, which Robert fought against, but even when they did include these scenes, they were clunky and unexciting. The studio even wanted a scene with Johnny on a bus, because it was featured heavily in speed. The photography wasn't what Robert intended. The DP lit things too bright, revealing too much of the sets. He felt it cheapened the movie. In later interviews with Longo and Arthur Gibson, they both said nobody got to see the film they shot. Robert even suggested he was going to recut the film to 45 minutes, remove Dolph Lundgren entirely, and grade it in black and white for its 25th anniversary, and just put it online for everyone to watch. Well, come 2020, we'll see if he kept his promise. With the film's story, it's set in the future of 2021. Johnny is a mnemonic courier with a data storage device implanted in his brain. His handler Ralphie sends him out on his last assignment before he gets the implant removed. He heads to Beijing to meet the clients. His brain can store up to 80 gigabytes, but he uses a device to compress it, essentially doubling what he can hold. He meets with the client, which he realises is a group of young scientists, who tell him they want him to carry 320 gigabytes of memory. Johnny accepts this, knowing that the overflow of data can cause psychological damage and death if not removed within a few days. Johnny doesn't let on that he can't store that amount, and uploads the data to his storage, with the scientist selecting 3 random images from a television screen to use as an encryption key. Just as the scientists are about to send the key to the data's receiver in Newark, they are attacked by the Yakuza. Johnny fights his way out and escapes with a portion of the encryption key and the data intact. The global pharmaceutical company Pharmacom, led by executive Takahashi, hire the Yakuza to get the data back. The Yakuza, led by Shinji, find out that the data they were hired to collect holds the cure to NAS, and they want to claim it for themselves. Takahashi discovers their plans to go against his wishes, and sends out the priest to retrieve Johnny's head. Johnny luckily got to Newark and needs to get the data out of his head quickly, but Ralphie has double-crossed him, and the Yakuza is on his trail. He gets help from a NAS sufferer called Jane, who acts as a bodyguard and has connections that could help remove the data safely. Johnny now has the priest and the Yakuza after him, and he is running out of time before the data in his brain kills him. Now, the plot I just discussed is for the theatrical cut. Now, there was a longer version released in Japan. This isn't a director's cut. Robert Longo doesn't approve of neither versions, as he didn't have full control and says only 65% of what he wanted is in the film. This version has a different score, which will be discussed a bit later. This cut is roughly 15 minutes longer. The film includes extra scenes of dialogue and violence, but the majority of the extended scenes focus more on Takashi. As he was a superstar in Japan, this cut is tailored more towards him. These scenes include Takahashi sitting in what it appears to be his late daughter's room, watching a 3D hologram of her. Takahashi is also seen later on watching a videotape of his daughter while self-meditating, and we see Takahashi killing 2 of Shinji's henchmen. The scene near the beginning with the protesters is longer, and there is the inclusion of a news anchor. There is a scene added in a Beijing hotel where Johnny obtains the memory doubler from a dealer, who informs him that he was unable to get an upgrade as advanced as was originally agreed upon. Doll's character, the street preacher, has an added scene where he's addressing his followers, where he claims to have been stricken by the sickness that devours the silver pathways of the soul, and has been healed by the Lord, making him post-human. He then notices Takahashi's henchman arriving with a cryogenic container for Johnny's head, and tells his followers that he must leave to meditate. Throughout the movie, his character has a few extra lines here and there. This version was released in the Japanese market, and I did get hold of it on Laserdisc a short while ago. You can now get it as an extra on the German Blu-ray release. It's only in standard definition, but the print is in good condition and makes for a nice extra. I personally don't think this cut drastically improved the film, but it did fill in some of the blanks and character development that was needed for the priest and Takahashi. Despite the issues labelled at Johnny Mnemonic, the visual effects were certainly impressive for the time, and featured heavily during its marketing campaign. There are 3 big FX sequences as Johnny uploads data, accesses the internet, and finally accesses his brain to extract the final image of the encryption key. A decision was made to have each sequence handled by a different FX studio, so they all had a different visual style and feel to them. During early previews, test audiences were really impressed with the visuals, so Robert wanted to include another sequence for the new prologue to introduce Johnny. They added a new main title sequence to throw people into the internet of the future. Sony Pictures Imageworks enlisted visual effects supervisor John Nelson to head the production. Nelson, an Industrial Light and Magic veteran, is best known for his work on Terminator 2 and more recently Blade Runner 2049. Nelson immersed himself fully in the material, and he flew to New Leaf Technologies in Silicon Valley to get first-hand knowledge of the world of virtual reality. He checked out a number of applications for VR. The programmers at New Leaf said he should forget about what VR is right now and visualise it as a rich, high-resolution, super-fast medium. John thought about using data gloves as a way for the audience to access cyberspace along with Johnny, so it takes them from the live action footage into the computer generated world. This technique of navigating data was also used in 2002's Minority Report. I think even by today's standards, these virtual reality sequences are still pretty impressive, even with the look of the internet being somewhat laughable in terms of what it will look like in a few years. I admire the design and thought put into it. With the attack on his own brain, it does make you think of Lawnmower Man and even Tron as he attacks the Pharmacom security. Even though the CGI sequences are done to a high level, the rest of the effects are a bit weak. I do like the laser whip used by Shinji, as it's nicely animated, but the matte painting of the Earth featured at the end of the movie looks unfinished, and the digital blue screen compositing is a bit wobbly and shot in a very bland way, seeming like a bit of a rushed job. Overall, the effects are above average, and considering its relatively low budget, the FX team did a great job with the VR sequences, which made it the key selling point of the film, and is probably what people remember about the movie, when they can't remember what the hell happened in it. The Japanese soundtrack for Johnny Mnemonic was handled by Canadian composer Mikhail Danner. He has over the years composed dozens of scores for films such as 8mm, 500 Days of Summer and Little Miss Sunshine, just to name a few. His score does follow a similar style to what Simon Boswell did on the 1990 movie Hardware. It has that industrial sound mixed with synthesizers and works really well with the film. Mikhail said a few years back in an interview, after he finished the score he left the country and went to India to teach English. Meanwhile, they cut the film for international audiences, and the music no longer fit, so they hired Brad Fiedel to rescore the film, hence why there was no soundtrack release of Danner's work. The Japanese distributor was happy with the longer version, and his score remained intact. Now, before I discuss Brad's contributions, there was another score produced but rejected in the early stages of the movie's production, as Sony wanted it to be more action orientated. The 90s industrial band Black Rain had provided a score, and their approach was very interesting as it takes on a very dark atmospheric sound. They had worked with Longo since 1984 and had been acquainted with Gibson after loving his book Neuromancer, and they even ended up recording the music to the audiobook. Black Rain did provide a song to the film titled Memory Johnny, but it only appeared on the Japanese CD soundtrack. Now, the score that remains intact for the international cut is Brad Fiedel's. Brad, who unfortunately left the industry years ago, is best known for his work on Terminator 1 and 2, Fright Night and True Lies. Brad wrote about his experience scoring the movie on his website. Brad revealed he wanted to try out a new technique to maintain the score throughout the movie without it being lost by loud sound effects. Many composers even today are battling with the sound mix, as sound effects often drown out the score, so the chance that one of them would be heard might be greatly increased, and the through line of the score might survive. This would have to be done as an organic part of the composition and style of the piece, and didn't want it to come across as gimmicky or distracting. Brad didn't want the audience to notice what the music was doing. He had done something like this in his electronic scores. A panned digital delay kind of has that effect, but this was an orchestral score with the help of the late great Shirley Walker, with some electronics mixed in. Brad wanted to try this acoustically. They recorded the full orchestra on these special cues including percussion, but without the brass. Then they reset the studio for 2 complete brass sections, one on the left and one on the right. They rehearsed the first cue but started having some problems with the balances. Shirley suggested reorganising some of the players so they were better matched, and it seemed to work. Shirley at first had serious doubts about the approach when he had described it to her, but she thought it worked really well. Sadly, Brad's work is not available in any great length. There are 2 tracks available to listen to on his website, and 1 track came with the official soundtrack release outside of Japan. There may be a complete release in future, as what he produced is very good, and his material still has a strong fan base. It's very much in the style of Brad's previous work. There is some Terminator influence in it, which I'm not going to complain about. It's obviously hard to critique on the whole as there is no complete score available, but what is available does work, and it's a shame Brad didn't continue with his film scoring career. As 1 track of his music was on the album, the rest was filled with songs from various artists, such as Stabbing Westward, Orbital, Bono and The Edge, KMFDM, and even star Henry Rollins and his band contribute a track. The songs are okay for the most part. I like the odd 1 or 2, but most weren't my cup of tea. Maybe when I was 15 and into Korn and Machine Head, I would have been all over this, but my music tastes have changed over the years. So if you're into your grunge music and heavy metal, give it a go, you might find some interesting tracks. With Johnny Mnemonic dealing with technology of the future, there was of course a video game, but not a very good one. Johnny Mnemonic, the interactive action game, was developed by Evolutionary Publishing for DOS, Windows, Mac and published by Sony ImageSoft. In typical 90s fashion and the use of CD-ROM, the game was in FMV. Oh, what fun! The player is given a nice slice of terrible writing and performances, and with little gameplay, as you click on icons and have little clue what is going on. Even when it comes to the fight sequences, there is no health gauge, so you don't know what you are doing is having any effect. The main point of the game is searching for computer parts. The game will rarely tell you what you're supposed to be going or doing, and have little control over Johnny. You end up dying a lot and having no clue why you died, making for a confusing and frustrating experience. I was never a fan of FMV games. Sure, Night Trap is a bit of a guilty pleasure for some, but 95% of them were barely interactive and never felt like true video games. You never felt in full control, as you just clicked in certain areas and at specific times to jump to the next clip. It just made for a dull and unexciting experience. After the amount of loading these games took in the day, you would find yourself quitting the game after 10 minutes. A Mega CD version of the game was also developed, but never released despite being fully completed. This version was eventually leaked onto the internet many years later. Surprisingly, no side-scrolling platformers were developed for the Super Nintendo or Sega Mega Drive, which is probably a good thing, as Sony ImageSoft's games were mostly junk. But there was a pinball machine based on the film released by Williams in August of 1995, which is worth playing if you spot it at a retro arcade or convention. Back in the 90s when this film came out, it was a movie I was aware of, but never really bothered to watch. I would see it advertised and later saw it on VHS rental store shelves. The one reason I really didn't bother to sit down and give it a go was that most of my friends who managed to catch it on Sky Movies or did rent it told me it was boring and a waste of time. I think with it dealing with virtual reality I was initially put off by it. The VR bubble of the early 90s had burst, people had tried out the technology at the time, and it didn't live up to expectations and gave people headaches. This novelty approach to experiencing a new reality just didn't work. It wasn't until years later with the Oculus Rift and Sony's VR that people got to experience something more believable and at a higher resolution. Films such as Lawnmower Man and 1995's Virtuosity dealt with similar themes, and when Johnny Mnemonic came out, they all in my eyes seemed to mesh together, and they all didn't work as complete movies. They had the ideas there, but the execution and the attempts to bring access to this advanced technology may have seemed great at the time, but it quickly became dated and a bit laughable with its predictions of the future. Sure, these movies may have got a few things right, with Johnny making a passing comment to an iPhone, but this is all by coincidence, and overall they felt a bit gimmicky. Johnny Mnemonic's biggest fault is its obvious meddling behind the scenes, resulting in a movie that doesn't know what it wants to be, but also is a dull experience with little surprises. Even though the director argued against it, the prologue and opening scene with Johnny does help the story find its footing. Without that, I think it would have been a bit confusing, and the world would have felt undeveloped. Once Johnny gets the data in his head, it becomes very repetitive, as he escapes from the Yakuza and then the priest, and finds himself at the base of operations of J-Bone. As he runs away from the bad guys, we are treated to unexciting action scenes that are shot with no real thought and seem rushed on the day. The editing as well is uninspired. It's cut in a very traditional manner and from someone who has little interest in the material. The story makes sense on Johnny's journey to remove the data, but everything around him, i.e. the subplots, don't really make a lot of sense or say carry little weight due to the footage being trimmed. The AI, who appears as a woman's disembodied head, played by Robert Longo's wife, that pops up to warn Johnny and appears to be assisting Takahashi, is poorly implemented into the story. We are informed she set up the company Pharmacom near the end, but this plotline is heavily compromised. With the performances, Keanu was unfairly treated at the time. He always got knocked for being wooden, and everyone thought of him as the airhead from Bill and Ted. To be fair, his performance in Dracula wasn't very good, but in Johnny Mnemonic he was trying his best to breathe life into the character, and it's clear he is dedicated to the part. There are some nice moments as he loses his temper, as he realises the world rests on his shoulders, and when he realises he has to get the assistance of a dolphin to hack his brain, his reaction is pretty genuine. This was actually the first time I heard the word gigabyte. I had no idea how much data that was. Most PCs at the time didn't have that storage space. 2 years later I was using zip disks to save my data at college, and they only had 100 megabytes on them. At the time the amount of data Johnny could store was pretty impressive, but when he overloads his head with 320 gigabytes, that's still pretty low by today's standards. A normal PS4 or Xbox One can store more data than that. Takeshi, who appears to have learnt his English lines phonetically, does get a better chance to shine in the extended cut, but his character is fundamentally poorly developed. But he does have great screen presence, and with his limited dialogue he still manages to make a strong impression. I always forgot Dolph Lundgren was in this movie. They obviously didn't make great use of him in either cut of the film. It's clear Dolph is trying his best, and he doesn't deliver a bad performance. He had proven to be a great villain in Rocky IV and Universal Soldier, but what we get is a character that just pops up now and again for the convenience of the plot. His death, however, is amazing. At first I didn't understand how the satellite was hurting him. As it's revealed, he is augmented, so he is basically a cyborg, and the signal from the satellite damages his insides and he explodes into a ball of flames. But what makes it so funny is Dolph's face as he pulls the funniest expression. Henry Rollins is not really an actor and does the best he can with the material. With him being a scientist and engineer, so to speak, I don't think he is best suited for this role. There is this kind of dude bro attitude to a lot of the supporting characters. These guys are supposed to be hackers, and most of them I wouldn't trust to format my hard drive. Dina Meyer and Ice-T are okay in the film. Dina does the best with what she is given, and her energy is there on screen. Ice-T seems on autopilot, just spouting techno babble, saying such nonsense as expanding the bandwidth and firing it out, etc. Most of the stuff he spouts on his illegal broadcasts make no sense, it's just total gibberish. What made me laugh is when he says set your VCRs. Surely they must have thought people would be using something else in the future. Maybe say set your video CDs or laserdiscs to record or something of that nature. Johnny Mnemonic is a mess with its narrative. It's clear there were too many cooks in the kitchen throwing in too many ideas, heavily diluting the director's vision and Gibson's story. The marketing was selling one vision of the film, and when watching it you feel a bit misled as it lacks the energy and excitement that was advertised. I do feel sorry for Robert Longo. It's clear the film really left him disillusioned with the industry. It's a shame the studio lacked the faith in his vision. We could have got something really interesting, or possibly we could have ended up with an arty, pretentious film that didn't really appeal to many people. But hey, it would have been interesting to see nonetheless. It's funny, when The Matrix came out, people felt it looked a lot like Johnny Mnemonic. A number of my friends didn't bother to see The Matrix on the big screen for that reason. I think its production problems and what it could have been is actually far more interesting than the final product. I'm sure there are many people who forgot about this movie, and I don't blame them. There are certainly moments in this film that raised my interest, but these moments are very few and far between, and the rest is very meandering. I highly recommend Robert Longo's audio commentary for the film, which he did recently for the German Blu-ray, as it's fascinating to hear the issues he had and what he really wanted to do. Longo and author Gibson have been very vocal over the years about their experience, and I'm sure there is even more information out there about its production problems. There is still a fan base for Johnny Mnemonic, and I can see why, but this film isn't for everyone. I think the average movie fan will certainly find it tough to watch, and you really have to be a fan of the material and the author William Gibson to get the most out of it. Overall, it's just an interesting failure that had good intentions and ideas that were heavily changed by individuals who didn't know what they wanted, but were just desperate for a hit, no matter what the cost.
Mr. Smith?
Pharmacom. You can't shoot me.
Not in the head.
Do you know what this man is carrying in his head? He's carrying the cure for NAS. Your daughter died to protect Pharmacom's profit margin. Treating the disease is far more profitable than curing it. They had the cure 8 months ago, Takahashi. Pharmacom, the company that I created. Let your daughter die.
I got this problem up here. You set me up, my friend.
The cure is